At this point, our pizza cutter has been in clamps for over an hour, and so we will take it out of clamps. And now it is time to sand the surfaces. We're going to start with 80 grit sandpaper. We're going to go to 120 and finish out with 220 grit sandpaper. The pizza cutter in your box came with a 60 grit sanding already accomplished. And you will notice also that a edge of about a 1/16 of an inch was put on your cutter. You don't want to sand that down any further. You don't want a finer edge on this wood. The finer the edge you go at this point, the more liable you are to break your pizza cutter when you utilize it. So as we sand, we do not want to take this edge down any further. We're not trying to sharpen the wood like we would a piece of metal. Another thing we want to do is we left these red oak accent dowels proud of the surface on both sides. So we want to, you can make a choice here. You may want to just round those over and leave little buttons, or you may want to sand them off completely flush. I'm going to choose to sand mine flush, and so I will take my 80 grit paper and I will work those down. One thing I want to do whenever I sand with the 80 grit paper or any of the sanding, when I take these buttons down, I want to sand with the grain of the Purple Heart. I don't want to go across the grain of the Purple Heart, or I'll end up scratching the surface of the Purple Heart. Remember, when you're sanding, you're actually scratching the surface of the wood. And when you go finer in your grit of sandpaper, basically all you're doing is removing the scratches of the previous sandpaper that you've used. So when we sand with the 80 grit, we're going to be removing the 60 grit sanding that's already been accomplished on the board, and so on and so forth. So we always want to sand with the grain of the wood, never across the grain like this. And by grain, I'm talking about grain direction. You can see the grain of the wood. So never go across the grain. You'll scratch it and it'll show up in your finish. Some of the pieces of wood that you received may have some layout marks. See these pencil lines? You want to be sure and sand those out. And whenever I get to the edge of a board like this, I can sand around that corner, but I don't want to sand across the grain on this end. So I'm going to turn my board and sand with the grain. And then I'm going to slightly round over the edge with my sandpaper as well. I'm also going to round over these sharp edges. We'll be gripping our pizza cutter when we use it. And so I want these edges to be comfortable. All these 90-degree, real sharp edges on the Purple Heart. So let's sand our project, and after we sand, we can talk about finishing with a butcher block oil.